"Keep your eyes on the road, Marco," Matteo commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that chilled the luxury sedan's interior. Beside him, his fiancée, Elena, adjusted her diamond ring, oblivious to the sudden, suffocating tension. The armored car idled at a rain-slicked crosswalk. Matteo's heart, long thought hardened to stone, suddenly stopped. There, rushing through the downpour in a faded waitress uniform, was Cora, the woman who had vanished 3 years ago without a trace. But it wasn't just the ghost of his past that made the air turn to ash in his lungs. Clinging to her hands were 2 toddlers. Twins. And even through the heavy rain, Matteo recognized his own dark, unmistakable eyes staring back at him. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers sounded like a ticking clock in the suffocating silence of the armored sedan. Outside, the city wept, neon signs bleeding into the puddles on the asphalt, casting fractured, colorful reflections across Matteo's sharp, angular face. He didn't blink. He couldn't. His dark eyes remained locked on the rearview mirror long after the crosswalk had faded into the misty distance. His hands, usually so steady, so capable of ordering the dismantling of entire criminal organizations without a tremor, gripped the leather steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity that threatened to snap it in half. Elena's voice, a high-pitched, aristocratic hum that he usually tuned out with practiced ease, buzzed in his right ear. She was talking about the floral arrangements for the wedding orchids versus lilies, the agonizing debate of a woman who had never known a day of real struggle. Matteo didn't hear a single word. The world had tunneled down to a singular, echoing image burned into his retinas. Cora. She was supposed to be a memory, a soft, painful bruise hidden deep beneath the iron armor of his current life. 3 years ago, he had returned to their shared penthouse to find it empty. No note, no packed bags, just a cold, vacant space where his entire heart had once lived. He had torn the city apart looking for her. He had utilized every resource, every contact, every dark corner of his vast, illicit empire to find her, but she had vanished like smoke in a hurricane. He had eventually convinced himself that she had realized what he truly was, a monster wearing a tailored suit, and had fled to save her own soul. He had forced himself to let her go, burying his grief beneath mountains of money, power, and eventually, a strategic engagement to Elena, the daughter of a powerful cartel ally. But there she was, not a memory, flesh and blood, running through the unforgiving rain, and the children. The thought struck him with the physical force of a hollow-point bullet to the chest. Twins, a boy and a girl, from the brief glimpse he had caught. They looked to be about 2.5 years old. The math was violently simple. It was a terrifying, undeniable equation that shattered the foundations of his reality. 3 years since she left. Twins who were walking, running, clinging to her hands. "Matteo, are you even listening to me?" Elena's sharp tone finally pierced through the ringing in his ears. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on his forearm. Her touch felt entirely alien. Matteo slowly turned his head to look at her. His expression was a carefully constructed mask of cold indifference, a look he used when negotiating million-dollar shipments or sentencing a traitor to the depths of the river. "I'm listening, Elena. Lilies are fine. Whatever you prefer." Elena sighed, retracting her hand, clearly annoyed by his detachment, but too invested in the political power of their union to push further. "You've been distracted all evening. If it's the docks issue," my father said. "It's not the docks," Matteo interrupted, his voice quieter now, yet carrying a weight that immediately silenced her. "Marco," he called out to his driver, his right-hand man, the only person in the world who truly knew the depth of the scar Cora had left behind. "Drop Elena at the estate." Marco's eyes met his in the rearview mirror. A silent language passed between them. Marco had seen her too. "Understood, boss." The rest of the drive was an agonizing blur. The moment the car pulled through the massive wrought-iron gates of Matteo's sprawling, fortified estate, Elena stepped out, sheltered by a guard's umbrella. She didn't look back as she ascended the grand marble staircase. The estate, with all its cold grandeur and empty luxury, had never felt more like a tomb to Matteo than it did right in this very second. "Marco," Matteo said before the driver could even put the car in park. "Turn around." "Boss, the meeting with the Russian syndicate is in 2 hours," Marco warned gently, his hands hovering over the gear shift. "Cancel it." Matteo snapped, the mask finally slipping, revealing the raw, frantic desperation underneath. "I don't care what excuse you use. Tell them I'm dead for all I care. Find out where that woman went. I want every camera on that intersection pulled. I want facial recognition run. I want a name, an address, a place of employment. Now, I already have my men on it. Matteo, Marco replied quietly. He was the only one allowed to use his first name. We tracked her to a diner on the Lower East Side. It's not a good neighborhood. Matteo's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Cora, his Cora, who he had dressed in silk and bathed in sunlight, was working in a slum, dragging 2 toddlers through the rain. The guilt was instantaneous, a suffocating wave that threatened to drown him. He had built an empire to protect her. And yet, she was out there, struggling, hiding from him. Take me there, Matteo ordered, his voice breaking slightly, a terrifying sound from a man who never showed weakness. Take me to her. As the car spun back out into the rainy night, Matteo stared out the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. He was a king of the underworld, a man who commanded fear and respect with a single glance. Yet, as he approached the Lower East Side, he felt like a terrified child. He was about to step out of the darkness and into the fragile light of a past he thought was dead. He was about to demand answers from the only woman who had ever dared to defy him. And deep down, he was utterly terrified of what those answers would be. The ghost was real, and she was holding the hands of his legacy. The diner was a decaying relic of a forgotten era, wedged between a pawn shop and a boarded-up laundromat. A flickering neon sign buzzed angrily in the heavy rain, sputtering the words Mabel's Eats in a sickly, pale pink light. Matteo sat in the back of his idling, unidentifiable black SUV, parked across the street in the shadows of an alleyway. For 2 hours, he had not moved. He simply watched. Through the rain-streaked window of the diner, he could see her. Cora. She was wiping down a greasy Formica table, her movements mechanical. Born of sheer exhaustion, she wore a faded pink uniform that hung loosely on her frame, a stark contrast to the vibrant, healthy woman he remembered. Her dark hair, once a cascading waterfall of curls that he loved to bury his face in, was pulled back into a messy, utilitarian bun, with a few damp strands plastered to her pale neck. She looked tired, bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that seeped into the soul and hollowed out the eyes. Yet, to Matteo, she had never looked more breathtaking. The sheer resilience radiating from her fragile form struck him with a profound sense of awe and a deep, agonizing shame. He watched as a burly, unshaven patron slapped her on the hip as she walked past. Matteo's hand instantly flew to the concealed firearm at his waist, his blood turning to liquid fire. He was halfway out the door, ready to march in and paint the diner's walls with the man's blood, when Marco's firm hand clamped onto his shoulder from the front seat. Don't, Matteo, Marco warned softly. You go in there like a wrecking ball. You'll terrify her. She ran for a reason. You need to be smart about this. Matteo forced himself to breathe, his chest heaving as he released the door handle. He watched Cora gently but firmly bat the man's hand away, her face tight with forced polite tolerance. She didn't have the luxury of anger. She needed the tips. The realization made Matteo nauseous. He, a man who threw away tens of thousands of dollars on a single hand of poker, was watching the mother of his supposed children endure humiliation for loose change. Where are the kids? Matteo asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. There's a back room, Marco replied, pointing to a small, dimly lit window near the alley side of the diner. The owner lets her keep them there during her shift. They're safe, boss. Safe. The word felt like a cruel joke. How could they be safe in a place like this? Matteo waited until the clock on the dashboard read 11 p.m. The diner's lights began to dim one by one. The last few stragglers stumbled out into the night. Cora moved to the front door, flipping the sign from open to closed and locking the deadbolt. He watched her slump against the glass for a brief second, allowing the fatigue to wash over her, before she pushed herself back up and disappeared toward the back room. Wait here, Matteo commanded, stepping out into the pouring rain. He didn't bother with an umbrella. The cold water was a necessary shock, a baptism to prepare him for the inferno he was about to walk into. He crossed the street, his heavy boots splashing through the deep puddles. He bypassed the front door, moving silently down the narrow, garbage-strewn alley toward the back entrance. He stood before the rusted metal door, raising his hand to knock, but hesitated. For a man who had kicked down the doors of rival strongholds without a second thought, His knuckles trembled as they hovered inches from the wet steel. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. 3 sharp, distinct raps. There was a long pause. He could hear the faint murmur of a television inside. And then, the soft, hesitant scuff of worn sneakers against the linoleum floor. "Mabel, I swear I locked the front." The heavy metal door creaked open, and the words died in Cora's throat. She froze. The dim light from the alleyway illuminated her face, capturing the exact moment her world stopped spinning. Her large, expressive brown eyes widened in absolute terror, the color draining entirely from her cheeks until she looked like a porcelain doll about to shatter. She tried to slam the door, a sudden, desperate reflex of pure survival, but Mateo was faster. He planted his large, calloused hand against the rusted metal, easily overpowering her frantic push. "Hello, Cora," Mateo said, his voice dropping an octave, fighting the overwhelming urge to pull her into his arms. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling, stepping back into the small, cramped hallway. No, you can't be here, you can't." 3 years, he stepped inside, the sheer mass of his presence dwarfing the narrow space. He closed the door behind him, sealing them in. The air instantly grew heavy, thick with the ghosts of their past and the electric tension of the present. 3 years, Cora. Not a word, not a trace. Do you have any idea what you did to me? Leave, she demanded, her voice gaining a desperate edge, her eyes darting toward a slightly ajar door at the end of the hall. "Mateo, please. I'll scream. I'll call the police." "The police?" Mateo let out a dark, humorless chuckle. "You know the police don't come when I'm involved, mi amor. And you know I'm not leaving." He took a step closer. She instinctively shrank back against the peeling wallpaper, her hands coming up defensively. The fear in her eyes was a physical blow to him. He didn't want her to fear him. He wanted her to explain. "I saw you at the Crosswalk today," Mateo said softly, dropping the intimidation, letting the raw vulnerability bleed into his tone. "I saw you in the rain, and I saw who you were holding on to." Cora's breath hitched. A solitary tear spilled over her lower lash line, tracing a clean path through the flour and exhaustion on her cheek. She shook her head rapidly. A desperate, frantic denial. No, you didn't see anything. They aren't." Before she could finish the lie, a soft, sleepy voice drifted from the ajar door at the end of the hall. "Mama? Who's the big man?" Mateo's heart stopped entirely. He slowly turned his head toward the crack in the door, peeking out from behind the wood, rubbing his eyes with tiny, chubby fists, was a little boy. He had a mop of unruly dark curls, and as he looked up at Mateo, his eyes dark, intense, and profoundly familiar locked onto the Mafia boss. Mateo felt the breath leave his lungs in a rush. He was staring into a mirror that reflected a timeline he had been robbed of. The undeniable, staggering truth stood in the doorway. He was a father. The hallway felt as though it had been plunged under water. Sound became muted, the air thick and difficult to pull into his lungs. Mateo stood paralyzed, his imposing frame suddenly feeling fragile as he stared at the little boy in the doorway. The child, no taller than Mateo's knee, stared back with a mixture of innocent curiosity and an inherent, defensive scowl that Mateo recognized with painful clarity. It was the same scowl he saw in his own reflection every morning. "Leo, go back to bed," Cora said, her voice sharp with panic. She lunged forward, positioning her small body entirely between Mateo and the boy, spreading her arms like a mother bird shielding her nest from a hawk. "Right now, baby. Go back to Mia." The boy, Leo, frowned but slowly retreated, the door creaking shut with a soft click. The sound of the latch engaging broke the spell. Mateo turned his gaze back to Cora. The fragile waitress he had watched wipe down tables minutes ago was gone. In her place stood a fiercely protective woman, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a maternal fire that dared him to take another step. "They aren't yours," she said, the lie slipping from her lips with desperate speed. "They aren't, Mateo. I swear to God." Mateo slowly closed the distance between them. He didn't move aggressively, but with the inevitable, undeniable weight of gravity. He stopped just inches from her, close enough to smell the stale coffee on her uniform and the faint, lingering scent of vanilla soap that used to drive him insane. "Do not insult my intelligence, Cora," he murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that resonated in the cramped hallway. I know how to count. And I know my own eyes when I look into them. You're seeing what you want to see, she cried out softly, mindful of the sleeping children, but her voice cracked with desperation. I moved on, Mateo. I met someone else right after I left. He died. But they are his. They have nothing to do with you or your world. Mateo reached out, his large hand moving slowly so he wouldn't startle her. He gently cupped her jaw. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. Her skin was freezing. You're a terrible liar, he whispered, his thumb lightly brushing the dark circles under her eyes. You always were. You used to bite the inside of your cheek when you lied to me about liking Marco's cooking. You're biting it right now. Cora's lower lip trembled. She squeezed her eyes shut, a dam breaking inside her. A sob tore from her throat, muffled as she brought her hands up to cover her mouth. The defiance crumbled, leaving only the terrified, exhausted woman underneath. Why? Mateo asked, the single word carrying the weight of 3 years of agony. Why did you run? Was I not good to you? Did I not give you everything? Was my love not enough? Your love was a cage, Mateo, she suddenly hissed, her eyes flying open, flashing with renewed anger. She pushed his hand away from her face. A beautiful golden cage, but still a cage. You think buying me diamonds and locking me in a penthouse with armed guards was enough? You are a mafia boss. Your hands are soaked in blood. Every time you left the house, I didn't know if you were coming back, or if your enemies were coming for me instead. I protected you, Mateo fired back, his own temper flaring. No one would have ever dared touch you. You were untouchable. No one is untouchable in your world, she countered, tears streaming freely now. I couldn't live like that anymore. The paranoia, the fear. I was suffocating. I had to leave to save myself. Mateo stared at her, the anger slowly draining, replaced by a cold, hollow ache. He had always known, deep down, that his lifestyle was the wedge between them. But hearing her say it, hearing the absolute terror in her voice, confirmed his greatest failure. He was a king who could conquer a city, but he couldn't make the woman he loved feel safe in his own home. So you stole my children from me, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a dangerous flatness that usually preceded violence. You decided I wasn't fit to be a father. I decided I wanted them to live. Cora fired back. I wanted them to grow up in a world where they didn't need bodyguards to go to the park, where they didn't have to learn how to check under a car for explosives before getting in. Look at me, Mateo. Look at where we are. She gestured to the dingy, peeling walls. I scrub toilets. I work double shifts. My hands are cracked and bleeding. Do you think I chose this poverty because it's fun? I chose this because a poor life in the light is better than a rich life in the dark with you. The absolute conviction in her voice struck him silent. She hadn't left for another man. She hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She had left because his world was fundamentally incompatible with the safety of their children. Before Mateo could respond, the door at the end of the hall opened again. This time, a little girl stepped out. She was clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit. She had Cora's delicate nose and Mateo's dark, unruly hair. She rubbed her eyes, looking between her crying mother and the giant stranger. Mama? Mia whimpered, her lower lip trembling. Why are you crying? Is the big man mean? Mateo felt his heart shatter into a million jagged pieces. The sight of his daughter, looking at him as if he were a monster out of a nightmare, was a punishment worse than any bullet he had ever taken. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, ignoring the damp, dirty linoleum. He brought himself down to her eye level. He desperately wanted to reach out, to touch her hair, to tell her he was her father, but he kept his hands firmly planted on his thighs. I'm not mean, little one, Mateo said, his voice softer and gentler than Cora had ever heard it. It was a voice he hadn't used in years. I'm just an old friend of your mama's. I'm sorry if I woke you up. Mia looked at him skeptically, then looked at Cora. Cora quickly wiped her tears, forcing a shaky, unconvincing smile. It's okay, Mia. He's just leaving. Mateo stood up slowly. He looked at Cora, a silent promise burning in his dark eyes. He wasn't leaving. Not forever. The rules of engagement had changed. He had found his ghost, and he had found his legacy. I'll be back, he murmured so only Cora could hear. And you will tell me everything. He turned and walked out into the rain, leaving a fractured world behind him, stepping back into the darkness to figure out how to tear his own empire down. The heavy oak doors of the syndicate's private boardroom swung open, and Matteo walked in. The room was a masterclass in intimidating opulence, dark wood paneling, leather chairs that smelled of wealth and cigars, and a sprawling view of the city skyline that Matteo supposedly owned. At the head of the massive mahogany table sat Tomas, Elena's father, and the head of the most powerful southern cartel. Elena sat to his right, perfectly composed, wearing a designer dress that cost more than Cora made in 5 years at the diner. Matteo took his seat at the opposite end of the table. He felt entirely detached from his own body. The men around him, his capos, Tomas's lieutenants, were discussing supply chains, border routes, and the distribution of illicit cargo. For the first time in his life, the words sounded like absolute static. Matteo, Tomas's booming voice cut through the noise. The older man leaned forward, his eyes shrewd and unforgiving. "You are quiet today. My daughter tells me you canceled a crucial meeting with the Russians last night to take a joyride. This is not the focus I expect from my future son-in-law." Matteo looked at Tomas, then shifted his gaze to Elena. She met his eyes with a cool, calculating stare. There was no love in this room. This marriage was a merger, a hostile takeover wrapped in white silk and diamond rings. It was designed to consolidate power, to create an impenetrable fortress of wealth and violence. "A personal matter required my immediate attention," Matteo replied smoothly, his tone betraying none of the absolute chaos raging inside his mind. "Personal matters are a luxury men in our position cannot afford," Tomas warned, tapping his cigar against a crystal ashtray. "We are 2 weeks away from the wedding. Once the vows are exchanged, our families merge. Your problems become my problems. If there is a loose end, Matteo, you cut it. Cleanly." The word sent a chilling spike of adrenaline through Matteo's veins. Loose end. That's what Cora and the twins were to these people. If Tomas or anyone in this room found out that Matteo had a secret family, an unprotected, vulnerable weakness living in the slums, they wouldn't hesitate. In this world, a weakness was a target. Cora wouldn't just be leverage. She would be a casualty. "There are no loose ends," Matteo lied, his voice a flawless, icy calm. "The merger will proceed as planned. I will handle the Russians today." The meeting dragged on for another hour, but Matteo's mind was miles away, trapped in a dingy diner on the Lower East Side. He pictured Cora's cracked hands. He remembered the terrified look in Mia's eyes. He contrasted the suffocating, sterile perfection of Elena with the raw, desperate warmth of the woman who had fought him in the hallway. When the meeting finally adjourned, Elena lingered behind as the others filed out. She walked slowly to Matteo's end of the table, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. "You aren't yourself," she noted, her tone conversational but laced with suspicion. "You haven't been yourself since we stopped at that crosswalk yesterday." Matteo didn't flinch. He remained seated, looking up at her with an unreadable expression. "I've been calculating the risks of the Russian deal. It requires focus." Elena leaned over, planting both hands on the table, bringing her face close to his. "My father is right, Matteo. We are building an empire. I need a king who is fully present. If there is some other woman, some ghost from your past pulling your attention." She paused, letting the unspoken threat hang heavy in the air. "It would be very unfortunate if she distracted you from your duties." Matteo felt the beast inside him awaken, the ruthless, violent predator that had conquered the underworld. He wanted to wrap his hands around Elena's throat for even implying a threat against Cora, but he couldn't. Not yet. He had to be strategic. He had to play the game until he could flip the board entirely. "There is no one else, Elena," Matteo said softly, standing up. He towered over her, utilizing his sheer physical presence to force her to step back. "My focus is entirely on my legacy." He left the boardroom and walked straight to his private office, locking the door behind him. Marco was waiting inside, standing silently by the window. "Report," Matteo demanded, pouring himself a generous measure of scotch, though he didn't drink it. "I pulled her background," Marco said, handing over a thin manila folder. "She lives in an apartment building 3 blocks from the diner. Rent is past due. She works 70 hours a week. The kids go to a cheap daycare during the day. No criminal record, no debts besides the rent. She's living like a ghost, boss." No social media, no bank accounts in her real name. She gets paid under the table. Matteo opened the folder. Inside was a surveillance photo taken that morning. Cora was walking the twins to daycare. She was holding both their hands, looking exhausted but smiling down at Leo as he pointed at a stray cat. The intense love radiating from the grainy photograph made Matteo's chest physically ache. "She's hiding from me," Matteo murmured, trailing a finger over the image of his son. "She's hiding from the life, Matteo," Marco corrected gently. "She knows what happens to people who are close to you. She's trying to keep them alive." Matteo slammed the folder shut. Marco was right. His golden cage was a slaughterhouse. As long as he wore the crown, his family would have targets on their backs. He had thought he could simply bring them back, surround them with an army of guards, and force them into his world. But seeing Elena's cold suspicion, hearing Tomas's veiled threats, he realized the terrifying truth. He couldn't have both. He couldn't keep his empire and keep his family safe. "Marco," Matteo said, his voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper, "I need you to double the guard on Tomas and Elena. I want to know every move they make. And I need a secure, untraceable safe house prepped. Out of the city. Out of the state." Marco's eyes widened slightly. He understood the implications instantly. "Boss, you're talking about a war. If you break the alliance with Tomas—" "I'm not talking about a war, Marco," Matteo said, turning to look out the window at the sprawling, dirty city he ruled. "I'm talking about an exit." The apartment building was a decaying monument to urban neglect. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and stale cigarettes, lit only by a single, buzzing fluorescent tube that flickered ominously. Matteo stood outside door 4B, the peeling numbers hanging by a single rusted screw. He was dressed down a simple black sweater and dark jeans, abandoning his expensive suits to blend in, though his sheer size and intense aura made that impossible. He didn't knock. He knew she wouldn't open it if she knew it was him. Instead, he pulled a small set of lockpicks from his pocket. The cheap deadbolt surrendered in less than 5 seconds. He pushed the door open silently. The apartment was painfully small. A tiny kitchenette bled directly into a cramped living space. Toys were scattered across a faded, threadbare rug. The air was chilly. The radiator was clearly broken. Cora was standing at the small kitchen counter, her back to him, furiously scrubbing a burnt pot. The sound of running water masked his entry. Matteo stepped inside, softly closing and locking the door behind him. He stood there for a long moment, simply watching the sharp lines of her shoulder blades through her thin t-shirt. "The landlord said he'd fix the heat on Tuesday." Matteo spoke, his voice quiet, but filling the small room. Cora shrieked, dropping the pot into the sink with a loud clatter. She spun around, snatching a small paring knife from the drying rack in one fluid, desperate motion. When she saw it was Matteo, her chest heaved, but she didn't lower the knife. "How did you get in here?" she breathed, her eyes darting to the locked door. "Get out." "I mean it, Matteo." "I'll scream. The kids aren't here," Matteo noted, looking at the empty playpen in the corner. "Daycare? Don't talk about them," she snapped, stepping out from behind the counter, keeping the kitchen island between them. "Why are you doing this?" "I told you everything last night. We have nothing for you here." Matteo slowly walked toward the living area, ignoring her weapon. He sat down heavily on the sagging, thrift store sofa. He looked exhausted, the weight of his empire and his secrets visibly pressing down on his broad shoulders. "You lied to me last night, Cora," Matteo said softly, resting his elbows on his knees, looking up at her. "You said you left because my world was a cage. Because of the paranoia. Because of the lifestyle. It wasn't a lie," she said, her grip on the knife tightening until her knuckles turned white. "It was a half-truth," Matteo corrected. "You're tough, Cora. You survived 3 years in my world before you ran. You handled the pressure. You handled the bodyguards. You wouldn't have run just because you were tired. You ran because something specific happened. Something terrified you enough to make you pack nothing and vanish into the night." Cora swallowed hard. Her eyes flickered away from his, looking toward the small window overlooking the alley. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "Tell me," Matteo demanded gently, not a boss ordering a subordinate, but a man begging for the truth. "What happened the day you left?" Cora slowly lowered the knife, the fight draining out of her. She leaned against the counter, wrapping her arms around her own stomach in a protective, comforting gesture. She looked at him, and for the first time, Matteo saw the profound, lingering trauma in her eyes. "You were away," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "In Miami, handling the port strike. You left Marco with me, but I sent him to get groceries. I was alone in the penthouse for 20 minutes. Matteo's blood ran cold. He remembered that trip. It was supposed to be completely secure. A package was delivered," she continued, a slight tremble entering her voice. "It bypassed security. The doorman brought it straight up. It was a small velvet jewelry box. I thought it was from you, an anniversary gift." She paused, taking a ragged breath. Tears began to well up in her eyes, spilling over her lashes. "I opened it," she choked out. "It wasn't a necklace, Matteo. It was a silver baby pacifier." She looked up, her gaze piercing right through his soul, and taped to the back of it was a 9mm hollow point bullet. Matteo stopped breathing. The room began to spin. A pacifier and a bullet. A direct, undeniable threat to an unborn child. "I had just taken the test that morning." Cora sobbed, the memory breaking her composure entirely. "I was pregnant. I was going to tell you when you got back. But someone already knew. One of your enemies, or maybe one of your allies. They bypassed your multi-million-dollar security system just to show me that they could reach me. That they could reach our baby." Matteo stood up, his massive frame shaking with a rage so profound it bordered on madness. Someone inside his own house. Someone had threatened his unborn children under his own roof. "Why didn't you tell me?" he roared, the sound tearing from his throat, a mix of absolute fury and agonizing heartbreak. "I would have leveled the city. I would have killed everyone involved. I would have protected you." "How?" Cora screamed back, matching his volume, tears streaming down her face. "By starting a war? By locking me in a bunker for the rest of my life? If they could get a bullet into your secure penthouse, they could get it into me. I didn't want to raise a child in a war zone, Matteo. I didn't want my baby's first sound to be gunfire. So I ran. I chose poverty. I chose exhaustion. I chose hiding, because it was the only way to guarantee they would live." Matteo stared at her, the horrific truth settling heavily onto his shoulders. She was right. His protection was an illusion. His power was the very magnet that drew the danger to her. She hadn't betrayed him. She had made the ultimate sacrifice to save his children. He slowly walked around the kitchen counter. Cora tensed, but she didn't step back. Matteo reached her, wrapping his massive arms around her small, trembling frame. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. She stiffened for a moment, and then completely broke down. She collapsed against him, gripping the fabric of his sweater as she sobbed out 3 years of suppressed terror and exhaustion. "I'm sorry," Matteo whispered into her hair, his own tears falling. A Mafia king weeping in a broken-down apartment. "I am so sorry, Cora. I failed you." He held her until her sobs subsided into quiet hiccups. He pulled back slightly, cupping her face in his hands, forcing her to look into his eyes. The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, absolute resolve. "Who do you think sent it?" he asked, his voice deadly calm. "I don't know," she whispered, but the delivery label had a crest on it. A double-headed eagle. Matteo's jaw locked. The double-headed eagle. The crest of Tomas's cartel. Elena's family. They had known about Cora. They had known about the pregnancy. They had driven her away to clear the path for Elena to marry him, to solidify the merger. He had been sleeping with the enemy, shaking hands with the men who had put a hit out on his unborn children. The game was over. "Pack your things," Matteo commanded, stepping back, his eyes burning with a terrifying, protective fire. "Pack whatever you need for the kids. We are leaving." "Leaving?" Cora panicked, wiping her eyes. "Matteo, no. If they see me with you..." "They already know," Matteo lied, needing to spur her into action. "We don't have time. Pack, now." As Cora scrambled to grab bags, Matteo pulled out his encrypted phone. He dialed Marco's number. "Marco," Matteo said, his voice echoing with the promise of violence. "Initiate the exit protocol and prepare a strike team. Tomas is a dead man walking." The rain had finally stopped. leaving the city slick and reflecting the sickly yellow glow of the streetlights. Matteo's SUV tore through the streets, Marco at the wheel, pushing the engine to its limits. In the back seat, Matteo sat beside Cora, his arm firmly wrapped around her shoulders. She was trembling, her eyes wide with renewed terror, clutching a small duffel bag that contained the entirety of her children's lives. They were heading to the daycare. Every second felt like an hour. The revelation that Tomas's cartel was behind the threat 3 years ago had shifted the paradigm entirely. It wasn't just a matter of a broken engagement anymore. It was an active, breathing war, and the enemy had a 3-year head start. "Talk to me, Marco." Matteo barked into the front seat, his eyes scanning the dark streets passing by. "I've got 3 perimeter teams converging on the daycare now," Marco reported, his voice tight with adrenaline. "But boss, things are moving fast. Word leaked that you canceled the Russian deal. Tomas's men are mobilizing. They know something is wrong. They have spotters outside the estate. Let them watch the empty house," Matteo growled. "Are we clean right now?" "As clean as we can be in a rush," Marco replied, taking a sharp corner that pressed Cora against Matteo's chest. "But if Tomas put the hit out 3 years ago, he never stopped looking for her. The moment you showed interest in that diner, he would have been notified," Cora gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, the diner. When you came to the diner, someone saw you. I was careful," Matteo assured her, though a cold dread began to pool in his stomach. "In this city, careful isn't enough," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Matteo, if they know about the diner, they know about the apartment. If they know about the apartment, they know about the daycare," Matteo finished the thought, his blood turning to ice. He leaned forward, gripping the back of Marco's seat. "Faster, Marco. Run the lights. I don't care." The SUV surged forward, the sirens hidden in the grille blaring to life, scattering civilian traffic like roaches. Matteo pulled a heavy, matte black handgun from his shoulder holster, checking the chamber with a sharp, metallic clack. Cora flinched at the sound. It was the sound of the world she had run from, invading her fragile sanctuary. "I won't let them touch you," Matteo said, his voice a low, fierce vow. He turned to her, placing his large hand over her trembling ones. "I swear on my life, Cora, they will have to empty every gun they have into me before they get within 10 feet of you or the children." Cora looked at him. The terrifying, ruthless Mafia boss was back. The man who ordered executions and ruled through fear. But as she looked into his dark eyes, she didn't see a monster. She saw a father, a desperate, cornered lion willing to burn the world down to protect his cubs. "Just get my babies," she pleaded, tears spilling over. "Please, Matteo, just get them." "We are 2 blocks away," Marco announced, gripping the steering wheel tight. Suddenly, Marco's encrypted earpiece chirped. Matteo watched Marco's face drain of color in the rearview mirror. "Say again?" Marco yelled into the comms. "Status! Give me status!" A heavy silence filled the car. Marco ripped the earpiece out, swearing violently in Italian. "What?" Matteo demanded, the weapon in his hand feeling impossibly heavy. "Perimeter Team 1 just arrived at the daycare," Marco said, his voice shaking. 2 black vans are parked out front, unmarked. 4 men in tactical gear are moving toward the entrance. They are Tomas's hit squad. Cora let out a gut-wrenching scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated maternal agony. She clawed at the door handle, ready to throw herself out of the moving vehicle. Matteo grabbed her waist, hauling her back against the seat, pinning her securely. "No, let me go, my babies!" she shrieked, fighting him with surprising strength. "I've got them! I've got them!" Matteo roared over her screams, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. "Marco, ram them! Do not stop! Drive right through them!" The SUV rounded the final corner. The daycare, a small, brightly painted brick building, came into view. Just as Marco had said, 2 black vans were idling out front. 4 large men in heavy coats were jogging toward the glass front doors, weapons drawn. There was no time for strategy. There was no time for negotiations. This was the raw, brutal reality of Matteo's world colliding with the innocent light of Cora's. "Brace!" Marco yelled. Matteo threw his massive body entirely over Cora, shielding her with his back. pressing her down into the floorboards of the SUV. The heavy armored grille of their SUV slammed into the side of the first black van at 60 miles an hour. The sound of rending metal and shattering glass was deafening. The impact spun the van violently onto the sidewalk, pinning two of the hitmen against the brick wall of the daycare. Before the SUV had even fully stopped moving, Matteo kicked his door open. He didn't hesitate. The time for talking was over. The shadows had closed in, and Matteo was ready to become the darkest thing in them. Gunfire erupted instantly, shattering the quiet afternoon. The remaining two hitmen near the daycare doors turned, raising automatic weapons toward the crashed SUV. Matteo moved with a terrifying, practiced lethality. He rolled out of the heavy armored door, utilizing it as a shield. The air filled with the deafening crack of incoming rounds sparking against the reinforced steel. He didn't blind fire. He took a calculated breath, stepped out from cover for a fraction of a second, and fired twice. The first hitman dropped instantly, a clean shot to the chest. The second man scrambled for cover behind a concrete planter, laying down a suppressing spray of bullets that blew out the back window of Matteo's SUV. Inside, Cora screamed, curled into a tight ball on the floorboards, hands over her ears. "Marco, cover!" Matteo roared over the gunfire. Marco, bleeding from a cut on his forehead from the crash, kicked his own door open and fired rapidly over the hood of the car, forcing the second hitman to keep his head down. Using the distraction, Matteo sprinted across the open sidewalk. He didn't feel the glass crunching beneath his boots. He didn't feel the burn in his lungs. His entire existence was focused on the glass doors of the daycare just 10 feet away. He reached the concrete planter, vaulting over it with fluid grace. The hitman looked up, eyes wide with panic as a titan of a man descended upon him. Matteo didn't waste a bullet. He drove the butt of his heavy pistol into the man's temple, knocking him unconscious instantly. The street fell eerily silent, save for the hiss of the SUV's ruined radiator and the distant wail of approaching sirens. "Clear!" Marco yelled, scanning the street, his weapon raised. Matteo didn't stop. He kicked the shattered glass doors of the daycare inward, stepping over the threshold. Inside, it was chaos. The teachers had huddled the children into the back rooms at the sound of the crash. Toys were scattered everywhere, small tables overturned in the panic. "Leo! Mia!" Matteo roared, his voice echoing off the brightly painted walls. It wasn't the voice of a mafia boss. It was the raw, desperate cry of a father. A young teacher poked her head out from behind a barricaded door down the hall. She took one look at Matteo, covered in glass dust, a gun in his hand, and screamed. "Where are the twins?" Matteo demanded, marching toward her, pointing the barrel of his gun at the floor to show he wasn't a threat, though his presence was terrifying enough. "Cora's children. Where are they?" They're here," the teacher stuttered, stepping aside. Matteo pushed past her. In the small, windowless supply closet, a dozen toddlers were huddled together, crying. In the very center, holding on to each other, were Leo and Mia. Matteo dropped to his knees, his gun clattering uselessly to the linoleum floor. The adrenaline crashed, leaving him shaking. He reached out, his massive, blood-stained hands trembling as he pulled both of them into his chest. "I've got you," he whispered fiercely, burying his face in their small shoulders. "I've got you. Nobody is going to hurt you," Mia cried softly, clinging to his sweater. Leo, surprisingly, didn't cry. He looked at Matteo, his dark eyes wide, absorbing the chaos. He reached out a tiny hand and patted Matteo's cheek. "Big man saved us," the boy whispered. Matteo let out a choked sob, pressing a kiss to the boy's forehead. "I'm your father, Leo," he whispered back, the truth finally spoken aloud. "I'm your dad." "Matteo!" Cora's frantic voice echoed down the hall. A second later, she crashed into the closet, falling to her knees beside him. She wrapped her arms around the twins, sobbing hysterically, checking every inch of them for injuries. When she realized they were safe, she looked up at Matteo. Her eyes scanned his face, the gun on the floor, the blood on his knuckles. She had just witnessed the monster she had run away from. She had seen the violence he was capable of bringing to her doorstep, but as she looked at him, cradling her children like they were the most precious things in the universe, the fear vanished. He hadn't brought the violence to them. He had stood between them and it. "We need to move," Marco interrupted, appearing in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the hallway. Police are 2 minutes out. Tomas will send more men. We can't hold this position. Mateo nodded, his face hardening back into the mask of command. But this time, it was different. He wasn't commanding an empire of crime. He was commanding the survival of his family. He stood up, scooping Mia into his left arm. He offered his right hand to Cora. She looked at his hand, large, scarred, and capable of immense destruction. Then she looked at his eyes, filled with nothing but desperate love. She placed her hand in his. He pulled her to her feet, and Leo grabbed onto Cora's other hand. They moved out of the daycare as a single, unbroken unit. They stepped over the shattered glass and the bodies of Tomas's men. Marco had hot-wired one of the hitmen's undamaged black vans. They piled into the back. As the van sped away, leaving the sirens and the wreckage behind, Mateo looked at Cora. She was clutching the children, but she was leaning against his shoulder. The war had officially begun, but for the first time in 3 years, Mateo felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The warehouse was cavernous, cold, and smelled of rust and salt air from the nearby docks. It was neutral ground, heavily guarded by men from 3 different syndicates to ensure a parley without bloodshed. Mateo sat alone at a rusted metal table in the center of the vast space. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, impeccably pressed, a stark contrast to the violence of the previous day. Across from him sat Tomas, his face purple with restrained rage, and Elena, who looked more like an ice sculpture than a human being. A dozen of Tomas's heaviest enforcers stood behind them, their hands resting menacingly on concealed weapons. Mateo had come alone, a dangerous play that signaled either absolute madness or absolute confidence. "You understand what you've done," Tomas spat, the words dripping with venom. "You assaulted my men. You broke the engagement to my daughter. You have insulted my family, Mateo. In our world, that is a death sentence. Your men tried to murder my children, Tomas," Mateo replied, his voice deadly calm, echoing loudly in the empty warehouse. He leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the metal table. "3 years ago, you sent my pregnant fiancée a bullet. You tried to end my bloodline before it even began. You think an insult to your family warrants a death sentence? What do you think an attack on mine warrants?" Tomas's eyes narrowed. He didn't deny it. She was a weakness. A waitress. She had no place beside a king. "I did what had to be done to ensure you were strong enough to merge with my empire." "Your empire," Mateo scoffed softly. He reached inside his suit jacket. Instantly, a dozen guns clicked, aimed directly at his head. Mateo didn't flinch. He slowly pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger and tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "What is this?" Elena asked, her voice sharp and brittle. "That is the crown," Mateo said softly. He leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his jacket. "That ledger contains the access codes to offshore accounts holding $400 million. It contains the deeds to the shipping ports, the distribution networks, the dirty politicians, and the police captains on my payroll. It is the entirety of my empire." Tomas stared at the book, his greed warring with his pride. "And what is the price?" "The price is my exit," Mateo stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I am walking away. Today. I surrender my territories to you. I surrender the wealth. I am giving you the monopoly you've always wanted." Elena laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You're giving up everything for a diner waitress and 2 bastards?" Mateo's eyes locked onto Elena's, and for a fraction of a second, the absolute, terrifying demon that ruled the underworld flashed behind his irises. Elena stopped laughing, involuntarily taking a step back. "I am giving up a prison," Mateo corrected her, his voice a low, vibrating threat. "And they are my heirs. Here are the terms, Tomas. You take the empire. In exchange, my family is untouchable. If anyone from your cartel, or anyone you employ, comes within 1,000 miles of Cora, Leo, or Mia, I won't come back as a boss." Mateo stood up slowly, towering over the table. "I will come back as a ghost. I won't have territories to protect. I won't have businesses to run. I will have nothing but time and a singular purpose. I will hunt down every captain, every lieutenant, every foot soldier in your organization. I will burn your houses to the ground with your families inside. I will dismantle you piece by piece until the name Tomas is erased from history." The absolute conviction in Mateo's voice chilled the room. The enforcers shifted uneasily. Tomas looked at the man who had conquered the city. He realized Mateo wasn't making a threat. He was stating a fact. A king with nothing to lose was the most dangerous creature on earth. "You think you can just walk away?" Tomas asked, his voice losing some of its bluster, eyeing the ledger. "I just did," Mateo said. He turned his back on them, a deliberate show of disrespect and dominance, and walked toward the massive rolling doors of the warehouse. He didn't look back to see Tomas snatch the ledger from the table. He didn't care. The money, the power, the fear, it was all worthless. He had spent his entire life building a fortress of shadows, only to realize the only thing he wanted to protect was the light. He pushed the heavy metal door open, stepping out into the blinding afternoon sun. For the first time in his adult life, Mateo felt the weight of the crown lift from his shoulders. He was no longer a boss. He was just a man. And he was going home. The coastal house was a stark contrast to the cold, sprawling estate Mateo used to call home. It was a modest, beautiful farmhouse overlooking the ocean, bathed in warm sunlight and surrounded by tall grass. It was miles away from the city, miles away from the sirens, the concrete, and the shadows. It was a place designed for living, not just surviving. Mateo parked his unmarked truck in the driveway. He sat for a moment, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the waves in the distance. He took a deep breath. The air smelled of salt and pine, entirely devoid of the scent of blood or cordite. He walked up the wooden porch steps and opened the front door. The house was filled with the sound of laughter. It was a sound that still startled him, a joyful noise that he was slowly learning to accept as a permanent fixture in his life. He walked into the sun-drenched living room. Cora was sitting on the floor, surrounded by wooden building blocks. She looked healthier. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, replaced by a soft, peaceful glow. She wore a simple white sundress, her hair falling freely down her back. When she saw him, a genuine, radiant smile broke across her face. "You're back," she said softly. "It's done," Mateo replied, stepping into the room. The two words carried immense weight. "The transfer is complete." Tomas accepted the terms. "We are ghosts." Cora closed her eyes, letting out a long, trembling breath of sheer relief. The nightmare that had chased her for 3 years was finally, truly over. She stood up and walked into his arms. Mateo wrapped her up tightly, burying his face in her neck, inhaling the sweet vanilla scent he had missed for so long. "Daddy!" Mateo turned just in time to catch Leo, who had launched himself off the sofa like a tiny missile. Mateo swung the boy up into the air, eliciting a peal of delighted laughter before settling him onto his broad hip. Mia came running in from the kitchen, her face covered in chocolate, holding a half-eaten cookie. She grabbed Mateo's pant leg, demanding to be picked up as well. With a soft chuckle, Mateo scooped her up with his other arm, holding both of his children against his chest. He carried them over to the large bay window, looking out at the vast, endless ocean. Cora stepped up beside him, wrapping her arm around his waist, leaning her head against his shoulder. Mateo looked at the man reflected in the glass. He was wearing a simple t-shirt. His hands were empty of weapons. The terrifying aura that used to suffocate rooms was gone, replaced by a quiet, immovable strength. He had traded a criminal empire for a wooden house, traded billions of dollars for a pile of building blocks, and traded absolute power for absolute peace. "Do you miss it?" Cora asked softly, looking up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of regret. The power, the respect. Mateo looked down at Leo, who was playing with the collar of his shirt, and then at Mia, who was sleepily resting her chocolate-covered cheek against his shoulder. He felt the steady beat of their tiny hearts against his chest. This was his real legacy. This was the only thing he had ever truly conquered. "I never had real power, Cora," Mateo murmured, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Not until I had something worth losing. I don't miss the dark. I only ever wanted the light." He held his family tighter as the sun began to set over the water, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and orange. The Mafia boss was dead, buried beneath the weight of his own sacrifice. But in his place, a father was born, standing in the light, finally home. True power is not found in the empires we build or the fear we command, but in the sacrifices we are willing to make for those we love. Matteo learned that a life lived in shadows, no matter how golden, is ultimately a cage. Sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from everything they've conquered to embrace the quiet, terrifying vulnerability of love. His journey proves that our past does not have to dictate our future, and redemption is always possible when driven by the pure, protective force of family. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep emotional tales. Let me know in the comments what you think Matteo's first legitimate job should be.